Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us today. I'm here because we find ourselves at a crucial juncture. Despite contributing less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions to the Earth, small island states really bear developing states really bear the brunt of the crisis. With temperatures and sea levels on the rise, along with dwindling fresh water, fiercer storms, floods, and droughts, it's really a race against time where every moment counts. So Prime Minister Davis, I'd love to begin with you today. You've made really strong calls for action and accountability on the climate crisis, especially for places like your Bahamas and other island nations. How has the impact of disasters, for instance, Hurricane Dorian, which we saw here, influenced the way that you see things on the global stage? How have these crises influenced the way that you see things on the global stage? And how has that affected your efforts to find the solutions to the climate crisis?
You call the Hurricane Dorian, that was one of the most devastating hurricanes in recent times. And when I think about Hurricane Dorian, I'm reminded of the fact that that was yesterday. Right? But my yesterday is your today, and it's soon fast becoming all of our tomorrow. And that is where the efforts have to be to ensure that it does not become our tomorrow. Dorian has influenced me tremendously because what it highlighted, as you indicated earlier, that countries like mine that has not contributed to the CO2 emissions. In fact, statistics shows that we contribute less than 0.01% to we are the most vulnerable and we impacted most. We bear the brunt of it all. Following Dorian, what we saw, the aftermath of Dorian, we saw the most vulnerable in our society, the elderly, the women, the young people, those who are mentally challenged, the disabled, who are most affected by the impact and the consequences. But they're still recovering from the trauma of that event. When it rains, many of them still squirm in horror. So something has to be done. It also reminds me that small island developing states like ours, we're in a cycle of disaster and death. We are not talking about the fact that another hurricane may come, one that may be more devastating than Dorian. The only question is when it'll come. And if we don't do something soon, we all will become climate refugees somewhere, or we'll all be doomed to what I call a watery grave because of rising sea levels. That has influenced me to continue my advocacy, to call upon those nations who are the culprits to match their actions, match their action with the words and their commitments. They talk a good talk, commitments are made, and in fact, I've told the world that I'm commitment and pledged fatigued. Because I tell you, in 2015, there was a $100 billion pledge. Where are we with that? Last COP, the loss and damage fund was created. They're just now meeting as we sit here in Dubai, attempting to find how to operationalize that. And while all those things are happening, we have, for example, I've asked the question to the United States, let your action match what you're saying. So what signal do you send to me, a small island developing state, when last year you're going to, I think it was last August, October, you're going to authorize the construction of a new oil refinery that's going to produce 369,000 barrels of oil a day. What message is that to me? What message I told the United Kingdom, the UK? What message are they telling me when they authorize the development of their largest oil find in the Midlands? Is that matching what they're saying, what they're committing to? And so those, what I call inherent contradictions, is what is troubling small island developing states like ours. And that is what's influencing my continued advocacy for not just climate justice. I'm trying to ensure we have to change the narrative somewhat to let them know that it is in their own interest, their own enlightened self-interest, to do something about it. Because next, instead of having millions of refugees coming to their shores, those millions are going to turn into tens of millions, then hundreds of millions.
Absolutely. Thank you for all of your work on the global stage. Vishal, I want to congratulate you on your Global Citizen Award. And I think as we heard from the Prime Minister, it's clear that island nations are once so affected by the climate crisis, but also that so many in island nations are really at the forefront of pushing for immediate action and pushing for solutions. So I'd love to ask you a little bit about how your homeland of Fiji is experiencing the climate emergency and what factors have led to island nations becoming such sort of central voices in the fight for climate justice.
I think the situation back home in Fiji and around the Pacific is existential, and that's how we define the problem of climate change back home in the region. We're seeing whole nations under threat of being lost if climate change is not addressed. And we have people and communities that have been faced or are thinking about how do we face the reality of losing our homes and our homelands. We have cyclones that used to be one in a decade scenarios or instances now becoming far more frequent. We had just in Fiji tropical cyclone Winston, which was a Category 5 storm, which in a matter of hours wiped away almost 60% of our GDP. And that's the reality in many countries. And the sad situation is that we have to keep facing with these realities. As the Prime Minister said, we're in a cyclone cycle. And you have had people now, and the toll that these natural disasters take on people is also severe. You have mothers who have been forced to live in tents for years because their homes have been blown away and they can't go back, and they've had to give birth in tents, and they've had to raise children who have been living in tents for years. We've had villages that have been forced to relocate. So that right now in Fiji, we've got more than 40 villages that have been identified as needing relocation because they're too close to the coast, and the seawater is now coming in so close that it's basically uninhabitable for them to live there. And so the reality is that many of these villages have to leave, and the situation in the Pacific is that there is such a deep connection between the people and the land that when leaving the islands, when leaving the land that you were born in, it becomes such a painful journey, because you have to leave your ancestral burial grounds, you have to leave your connection to the concept of what we call the vanua, and we have to move to a completely new place. And I think all of these situations looked together as the severity of the impacts of climate change become more and more real, has pushed the Pacific to look for these new and innovative solutions into how we can address the climate crisis. But I think one other thing that has helped us and has pushed us to move into a space of climate leadership is the resilient spirit of the Pacific. My colleagues back home in the Pacific Climate Warriors have this line that they use, and it says, "We're not drowning, we are fighting." And that's the echo, that's the sentiment, the spirit that we're working with. And so I think all of this has led to why the Pacific has been at the forefront of climate leadership, along with many other small island developing states.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all your work. And Andrew, you are coming at this from a bit of a different perspective. You created and produced a new docuseries called Hope in the Water, wherein you travel to island nations and coastal towns to meet with farmers and fishermen and innovators who are directly impacted by the climate crisis. Could you tell me why it's important for you to tell those stories and how those stories could help to shape broader discussions about climate policy?
Well, I think it's of vital importance to tell these stories because in many cases, our governments around the world, our investment strategies are failing us. We need to be treating this planet like the long-term asset that it should be, as opposed to a short-term way to make money. So by illuminating different places around the world that are creating their own mechanisms for survival. I'm hoping that we can both draw attention to the problem, but at the same time, inspire people to make the right kind of change. You know, both of my colleagues on the panel were talking about different aspects of climate refugee situation, and I would just like to remind people, you don't have to go to the Bahamas or to Fiji to find a climate refugee. I found them in Apalachicola, Florida, where the entire oyster industry is essentially wiped out because there's too much fresh water because of the movement of rain, there's less rainwater, it's moved north. And so the water is more saline there. Oyster drillers came in, wiped out the largest oyster bed in North America in a matter of years. So people have left that area for jobs. There's no more tourism there. It's a very, very sad story. On the positive side, you know, we went down to Puerto Rico, just a few miles from where the Prime Minister's island nation is, and we were able to show how fishermen themselves, because they only fish for conch, red snapper, and spiny lobsters, but if they had changed the equipment on their boats, were able to get out 15 miles further in the ocean and gather a whole diverse range of species that are as reliable, but by using that diversity and incorporating it into their cooking, are able to keep people on the island, also ravaged by a hurricane, and we know is going to get ravaged by more, to create a more resilient food system. So I think that inspiring storytelling is something that can lead to positive change and educate more people. Look, I mean, you can turn on the news, right? That's one way of listening to a story. But I think when you have a docu-series telling it from the standpoint, by the way, we only have fishermen and problem solvers all across the world telling their stories themselves, and you hear it in their own words, I think it's very, very impactful.
Absolutely. Thank you for telling these stories. Vishal, I just want to quickly ask you a bit about your work campaigning for an advisory opinion on climate change from the International Court of Justice. Could you tell us how that initiative sort of came about and what the advisory opinion could achieve?
The idea for an International Court of Justice advisory opinion began in a classroom at the University of the South Pacific in 2019 by a group of 27 law students who asked the question about how can international law be used as a vehicle to address the climate crisis. And one of the most ambitious ideas that came about was to seek the ICJ's opinion on this matter, and then we've worked on a campaign to get the UN General Assembly to adopt a resolution on this, and only then the ICJ can consider the matter. And so this resolution was adopted last March historically by consensus, and the ICJ has since accepted the request, and we're now in the proceedings phase of the advisory opinion where countries are making submissions. And so it's well on its way. But what it can do, I think it's going to be a great tool that will get us closer to realizing climate justice. The questions that the ICJ has been posed are twofold, and these help address the problem of climate crisis. The first is about understanding country obligations. What should countries do at minimum? So far, the guiding document of conduct of states and what they need to do has been under the Paris Agreement. But this request to the ICJ is broadening that base to look at state obligations, not just under the Paris Agreement, but under all of international law. So that brings in human rights law, that brings in principles of environmental law, etc. And so by looking at international law more holistically, we're able to look at putting state obligations, or look at state obligations from a broader base, so that we're pushing in more accountability, we're pushing in more transparency and equity in addressing the climate crisis, which we are missing for so long. And so that's the first part on how the ICJ can help. And the second question that's been put to the court addresses the legal consequences. What happens when countries do not meet these obligations, which is so important to realizing climate justice, and especially for small island developing countries, because when there is a conduct that breaches international law, there has to be remedies. You have to face the consequences. And so this is an attempt to ensure that countries are held accountable for what they do. And this will have repercussions in pushing ambition across the board in areas like the just transition, the fossil fuel phase out and loss and damage, etc. And so it could be a game changer and a transformational step forward in our collective climate fight.
Absolutely. And Prime Minister Davis, I'll just wrap up with you. Speaking of fossil fuel phase out, it's something that you've been a sort of leading champion of. You've made it very clear that we can only take on the climate crisis by phasing out fossil fuels. Could you tell us a bit about how we can get there, how we can end our dependence on fossil fuels?
Well, I think the efforts, the advisory opinion that's about to be delivered shortly, I think I got notice that it may come down at the end of this month. We are part of that exercise. We've joined that and have put in a brief in respect to that. If emitting countries recognize that they have a responsibility and that they could be held liable and accountable in the sense of it touching their economic interests, I think they will start taking note. In addition to that, I just call on all of us as global citizens to do our part in protecting the environment and transitioning to EVs and smart use of electricity to curb our own emissions. We too could do our little part. I was just sharing a conversation today about during the pandemic, for example, when there was less flying, less use of vehicles, how the water seemed to be cleared, how the air seemed to be better. Perhaps we need to use less, we need to conduct ourselves in a way, personally, and make our own personal contribution to that fact by using things that do not emit CO2.
Thank you all so much for your work, and thank all of you. And to our global citizens who are eager to take action without your global citizen, or whip out your Global Citizen app and sign the petition calling on world leaders to sign a fossil fuel and non-proliferation treaty. Thank you all so much.